Alright, so I'll just stand up here and wait. Okay.
Yeah, you turned your screensaver off.
Screensaver.
And the sleep display, because if the screen goes to sleep, it'll
I don't think I have.
kill the recording.
Why can't I see it? Oh, here. Like that.
I'm going to give you the 10 minutes heads up, or 15 minutes?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah, I have this time down pretty well.
Okay, cool.
But it ends at 45, 35, 25.
There's 10 minutes between each one, so 12:35.
12:35. All right, yeah, I'll be good for time.
Okay.
It's kind of hot in these rooms, right? It's a little warm. Yeah. Is anyone here from Rutgers? No? Okay. I just have a friend there. What are some of the other talks you guys are going to? I think the last one, the Mad with Power module development, that one was really good. Matt Cheney is a great speaker. You should go to Designs to Drupal with Matt Cheney and Jody. They're great speakers. All right, I think I'm going to get started. So welcome to my talk, Beheading Drupal. I'm really excited to give this talk. I've given this a few other times before. This is a topic I really enjoy. I've been working on Drupal for the last 5 or 6 years. Been doing headless stuff for the last 2.5 years. There's a lot of really cool stuff happening in the JS world, and it's really great that we're able to just butt it up against what's happening with Drupal. So when you combine the two, you open up a lot of possibilities, with your sites and with your interfaces. And these are just some of my experiences. There are a lot of great other resources out there that cover similar topics. Just start off, who am I? My name is Williamson Vedder. I'm a developer at Blue Cadet in Philadelphia. Blue Cadet, we do websites, mostly Drupal. We do mobile apps, interactive touchscreens, immersive environments, universities, nonprofits, NGOs. So that type of space. I'm also an adjunct at Drexel. I teach JavaScript, and I also teach web development at Temple University. So the agenda of this talk, I'd like to explore some of the headless types, or the types of headless builds, go over some examples. But ultimately, I'm going to emphasize a particular approach. I'm going to do a D8 walkthrough, and then just give some of my personal takeaways, just some of the things I've learned. So just to start off, who here has implemented a headless setup before, or at least dabbled with it before? So, decent amount. How much of that made it to production? So like 3 or 4? Okay, cool. All right, I think this will serve everyone well. Just as a quick definition, headless or decoupled Drupal is the hard separation between the theming layer and the rest of the CMS. So Drupal handles all the content, handles all the data, and then sends that raw content to a front-end framework like React, Angular, Ember, Vue. And also for the rest of this talk, I might use headless and decoupled interchangeably, but they mean the same thing. Headless comes in a ton of different flavors. You have fully decoupled, you have a hybrid approach, you could have a CMS to CMS, you could have CMS loading JSON to a node server, you could have a CMS loading to a node server to a caching service like CouchDB. This is something that Lullabot does on their website. And really, there's a ton of creativity that you can mix and match with these. But for the purposes of this talk, I'll just be focusing on the first two. For the sake of comparison, a non-decoupled approach, or just the traditional, is no hard separation. Drupal handles the data processing and the theming, all on the server side, and then sends that back to the user. So this is business as usual, how you probably do sites now. The pros, you're likely pretty good at the setup, and makes sense to you. And everything's under the hood already. There's no additional modules, no additional libraries you need to add, so that's good. The cons, you could have slow and expensive asynchronous interactions. My favorite example of this is filtering views. If you're using views with filters, with Ajax, if you're filtering through a lot of content and it's a expensive query, it's going to be really slow and it's going to lag your site down. Also, similarly, it's very difficult to customize the markup and the type of attributes you add to some of these inputs. So again, I'm thinking of views filters, those types of inputs. They're hard to style, they're hard to theme, and it becomes very frustrating. Also, some modules are really great at extending the functionality of the site, and they do a great job filtering and making these great interfaces, but those are also hard to extend. They might not have documentation. They also might not have the proper hooks to extend those things. Also, these modules tend to blur the data theming line, doing theming in different ways, inconsistent ways. So it could make it frustrating as a developer to wrap your head around how to extend some of these modules that create these responsive user interfaces. On the other side of the spectrum, we have a fully decoupled approach. So this is the full separation between the data layer and the front-end layer. So think single-page applications. The only thing that Drupal does is handle the content, and it acts as an API to a JavaScript app like React or Angular or Vue, whatever. And then the user interfaces with this JS app directly. The only time the user would ever interact with the CMS is to actually edit the content. So to show you an example of this, This is all right, the video is working. This was a responsive web app we made for the city of Bethlehem. They have this really cool old steel mill ruins walkway where you can explore this old steel mill. And so they wanted to have an interactive guided walkway tour. And so you can see that all this is custom, all the interface is custom, the sidebar. There aren't any default elements. We built this with a WordPress backend. I know it's not Drupal, but the same thing applies. Also, we did this in Angular 1. And in order to get this type of complete custom experience, a traditional architecture wouldn't have made much sense for this. I don't even know what combination of views and nodes and templates we would have to use to accomplish this. So this really made sense as a fully decoupled architecture to get this type of custom experience. So the pros of this, you have snappy interactions because everything is all your markup is being rendered on the client side. So you don't have to make requests to the server and say, hey, I press this input button and has to interpret that and then add the network latency. All of it happens almost immediately on the client side. Also, you have fully customizable interfaces and markup. It all depends on what framework you use. Angular does it a little more, or at least Angular 1 did a little more template style, which beginners tend to favor a little bit more. There's some seats down here. I don't mind if you walk through. Also, it's easily swappable. So if you have a front end that you built in Angular, you could just one day say, all right, Angular is too much. I want to use React instead. And you can do that pretty easily. On the same token, you could say, all right, we built this backend in WordPress, but actually this doesn't suit our needs anymore. We want to do it in Drupal. So you can swap those sides pretty easily. And this is something that we've dabbled with before, but that hard separation is really what makes it easy to replace the front end and the back end pretty seamlessly. I also have security as a pro, and I say this generally, but when you remove the inputs, the default logins to Drupal, and you really remove access to the database and interactions with the database, you tend to make this site a little more secure, but that all depends on how you actually implement that. You are in control of how secure your site is, but generally a headless site could be more secure than a traditional built site. There are plenty of downsides with this that a lot of these headless talks don't mention. You're missing out on some of Drupal's best features. So editing in place, contextual links, the menu system, routing, built-in login, the 404, 403, great accessibility features that come out of the box with Drupal. These are all things that you need to rebuild if you built a completely headless website. Also, you have some SEO and crawler drawbacks. Because you're doing a lot of client-side rendering, Google, Facebook, all these SEOs and crawlers, they don't really know how to crawl your content and interpret it. They're getting better, but in my experience, it's less than perfect. Also, it's another framework to learn, develop, and maintain. This could be a pro if you have someone on your team who knows React really well, and then you could kind of isolate the two sides out and say you work on the front end, I'll work on the back end. That tends to work pretty well with our agency, but I set it as a con just because it's a requirement and you might not have that. Complexity of hosting, if you want to do it right, you'd probably want to do some server-side rendering on a node server. And also, you're relying on JavaScript. Sometimes the web isn't perfect. Lots of mobile browsers still have trouble with JavaScript, or if you're on Amtrak Wi-Fi or something, and a packet drops, you don't really know what could happen, but because you're relying on JavaScript, if something goes wrong, your site is inaccessible to your user. Also, proxy browsers, Opera Mini. I know that's not super relevant anymore, but it could be a use case depending on your client. Also, the initial bootstrap for these frameworks on mobile is pretty slow because JavaScript runs on a single thread and your phone might be pretty slow. The initial bootstrap might be a little sluggish. But the good news is it doesn't need to be all or nothing, and you can actually leverage the strengths of both. And this is what I call the hybrid approach. And so this is the idea is that some sections of the site have separation, a headless separation, while the rest of the sites don't. So think dashboards and calculators, just isolated miniature applications in your site that you can just pop in there if you want to have a really responsive custom interface, something that's quick and user-friendly. So the general breakdown of this, step by step, the user will request a page, the CMS will, the server will respond with some markup, and the important part here is that the HTTP response with that markup is the container for this application. So step 3 of bootstrapping the app, and then the app requesting from an API, and then getting from that. These steps 3 through 6 are all dependent on 2 occurring. But pretty much what happens is the user will bootstrap the app will get from the API, the CMS will return some data, and then the JavaScript app will parse that data, render the view, and then subsequent interactions like filtering, toggling view modes, that'll all happen over on this side. You won't actually have to, ideally, you won't have to make these expensive interactions to the server again. I'm going to show you a few examples, but this is a recent example of the new Princeton University undergraduate admissions page. I'll play this little video. Love this project. It was a great client, great project. But they had this contact us section where they received thousands of the same question every year. And so they wanted a place where all these questions were in one place. And they also wanted the ability to actually link to some of these questions, which it's kind of hard to see here, but there's this little link icon that will append a little snippet here. That's the some human readable component, and then the slug. But what this means is that if a student asks a question, or potential student asks a question, they can just send them this link directly, and it'll drop down and open it up for them. So this is a pretty basic example of a headless build. Also, worth mentioning, I turned JavaScript off right here, and I do have a no JavaScript fallback. It's not pretty, but all the content's there. It's crawlable. It's discoverable. But this is a pretty basic example, but I think it shows the upsides of the speediness, the interactiveness, and also the nice feature with appending the URL there. Imagine doing that in views. You'd have to have a lot of mess of jQuery there. But I'll show you an example that's a little more in depth. So BRIC is a Brooklyn organization that does a lot of arts and education programming and resources. And so they had all these great events, but we wanted to show them in a calendar. So this is a site that we built in Drupal 7, but this calendar application is built in React, and we're using Redux to store the state. And you'll see that all these interactions are really quick. They have these little pop-up boxes if you wanted to discover more about these events. Also, switching between these view modes, super trivial because you're doing all this on the client side. You're not actually having to say, oh, I want the grid view mode and the list view mode. Also, filtering. They have some filters based on location and stuff. At this point in time, there wasn't a lot of content, but we can toggle between months. And so we explored methods of doing this with Drupal and some jQuery options, but none of them really seemed robust and like a good user experience. We wanted this to be really quick, fun to use, and also pretty aesthetic. So that calendar page worked really well for us. And then if you clicked into one of these events, this is just a regular server-side rendered template. This is an event content type. There was nothing headless about this at all. So we just had that one calendar isolated for those interactions, but everything else is business as usual. One final example is I built a website for the Association for Public Art in Philadelphia. They want to be the authority for public art. So we have this dashboard for them where you can view all their content and you can search. So if you've ever been to Philadelphia, Alexander Calder is one of the local artists there. But they wanted to be able to view it based on like a map view, so you can see all these are pinned right here. You also can filter by the programming. The contrast is a little rough, but there's a lot of UI components here that filters really, really quickly on the front end. Built the back end in WordPress, and the front end was in Riot.js. But if I had to do this again, I'd probably do it in Drupal. But then I would just keep the same Riot.js app. So there's that the hot swapping of the back end again. So that was a great usage of the hybrid headless approach. Is just this semi-contained application smack dab in the rest of the server-side content. So the pros of this is that you have the speedy interfaces with JavaScript when you need it, and you have robust Drupal when you don't. So the upsides of both when you need it and whenever you want to implement it. Also, a great thing about this is that you can implement in stages. So with the brick example, I was a little ambitious and I wanted to build out the whole blog using the same technique. But then we realized that was a terrible idea, and Drupal's method of handling blogs and taxonomies, all the things that were native to Drupal, just lended itself so well to the blog section that we just scrapped it completely. But we kept the calendar because it made sense. But rolling out in stages is important because then you can say, all right, maybe we can do this post-launch as an enhancement. And also, because it's kind of isolated, you're kind of, depending on how your team works, you're not stepping on each other's toes. You could say, let's all, I'm going to be doing the calendar and you can work on the rest of the back end, something like that. So that isolated app development can be a pro for some teams. There are some downsides still. You still need to have a knowledge of another framework to learn, develop, and maintain. So if you have someone on your team who knows React or Angular pretty well, this could be a pro. But if you don't, you still have that requirement. And you still have some of these SEO and crawler downsides because the bulk of your content is being server or client-side rendered. Google, Facebook, all those crawlers are going to have a difficult time interpreting your content. This is avoidable though, and I will touch on that in a little bit. Does anyone have any questions before I go on any further? I don't mind if you raise your hand.
What was the JavaScript you're using for the map again?
I used Riot.js. If you have ever heard of egghead.io, they have a lot of great tutorials on Riot.js. The syntax, it's React-like. I call it like the little brother to React. But if you know React, there's really no need to know Riot.js. I just did it as an experiment. It has pretty friendly syntax. I'm also going to be doing the Drupal 8 walkthrough in Riot. Because I think the syntax for beginners is a lot easier to comprehend instead of seeing this mess of JSX. So yeah, Riot.js, then the trestle was in Angular, and then the map was in React. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to be doing a Drupal 8 walkthrough. It's great that everything's under the hood already in terms of making APIs. I'll be talking about some reflections I have about the headless hybrid approach, and be touching on API caching and server-side rendering to mitigate the SEO and crawler downsides. So another question. Who here is currently working on Drupal 8? Okay, great. The last time I asked that, just anecdotally, just the hands were so much fewer the last time I gave this talk, which was about 6 months ago. So it's pretty cool to see the rapid adoption. And of you, who are using D8 in production? Cool. All right. Nice. So just a general overview of the D8 walkthrough. We're going to be doing some pretty easy site building. Enable and include a module. We're going to create a view, which will end up being your API. Sounds complicated, but it's super simple. You're going to create a custom template, create an app, and then we're going to put that app into the custom template. So that's the general game plan. Again, we're going to be using Riot.js for this demo. It's React-like. So the first steps, just let you know what I did. I did a clean install. I duplicated Bartik to replicate a custom theme. I created a music player basic page and created a song content type with a artist field, embed code field, and a mood taxonomy. So So I should probably mention that this is going to be like a small music player application. And just to review this paradigm or this architecture again, the user is going to request from the server, and Drupal is going to bundle up all that markup, process, interpret the request, send up all the markup back to the user, at which point our little mini app is going to bootstrap and then request from our view or our API that we have on Drupal, and then it'll get that back, and then it's going to interpret that data and render it for the user to interact. I say repeat steps 4 and 6, but if you keep all the data stored in memory on the user side, you're really only doing steps 3 and 6, and you're really cutting out this need to make requests to the server, and you're really eliminating a lot of network latency here. So the benefits, the performance benefits, happen because you're keeping this link between the JavaScript app and the user. All that client-side rendering, it's going to happen really quick without the network requests. So working backwards from the data model, we're going to be creating the API, which is this leg of the step right here, the CMS. Drupal will send the data via JSON or XML to your JavaScript application. And so we're going to enable the Rest Ful Web Services module. It's included, which is great. And then we're going to make a view. We made a view. This is really terrible to see. But really it's just a view like any other view you've ever made before, except for the formatter. It's impossible to see, but it says serializer. This is something that Rest Ful Web Services module enables. So you really just set this setting, set the fields you want, and then you just set your endpoint. So this is /API/songs. So really, there's the only new parts here are the serializer formatter for your view. And then if you go to that endpoint, so much like if you have a view page, you have this path. If you go to that path, all of your content is served up via JSON, just raw content, and this is really great for your JavaScript app to interpret. So when you include the app into the template, this part of the process is really simple, but sometimes people tend to overcomplicate it. As you can see from this really intricate diagram, you have this node template, and then you have your music application adjacent to rendering your content. So really Drupal, regular Drupal traditional architecture, you would just remove this part right here, and you would just have render content. But I made a custom template, and I just shimmied this music app here. And I did that with a twig include here. And then inside that music player twig, I make reference to these different tags, which are used by the Riot.js framework. But really, the most important part is just including it into your custom template and just saying, all right, let's include all this JavaScript and all this app stuff. A little more technical details. That's a little bit more visible. But this is the actual app include. This chunk here is actually loading the JSON, and it's making accessing that endpoint that we created. So I have this on my local host, and really, when it succeeds, it mounts the app using the data that we retrieve from it. And then what happens is that it fills out this application tag, and it clears out all this content and loads, and then uses these scripts up here to intelligently client-side render this content in here. So the actual app component, I'll show you the code in a little bit, but the idea of it is that this is the step where it's really, maybe not 4 to 5, but it's like 5 to 6 where it'll retrieve content from the CMS, and then it'll parse it and display it to the user, and then all the subsequent this diagram is a little bit confusing. I'm sorry. I'll just skip it. So the actual app component itself, again, this is terrible how small this is, but you can see that this is just all pretty much HTML. I have a select list with some options. This will serve as my taxonomy filtering. I also have a button to reset the filters. I have this text input so I can search in real time against the content. And these scripts right down here, they're just methods and functions I created to go alongside this filtering. And all the content is, I have this song tag, and you have this each attribute, and that's like much like if you ever worked in Angular, it'll iterate through the content and then throw a lot of songs in there. But it really doesn't take a lot of markup. I have this in my repo if you want to look at it a little bit more clearly. But when you put that all together, you get a page that's kind of like this. Here, let me start over. It's already loaded, but anyway. So you get to the page, you have some content at the top. You also have these music, these songs. I'm searching by text, and that's happening on the client side really quickly. Resetting those filters. I also want to look via taxonomy term. It'll do that filtering really quickly. I also have this toggle player option where I can turn the turn the player on and off. And again, the snappiness of it is because all the content's being rendered client side. And just to prove to you, this is just a regular page. I'm going to edit this page and type test content. And when I save that, you'll see I have test content in here. But you can see the little lag it takes for the app to bootstrap, but it's pretty insignificant in most cases. And so you have a self-contained app adjacent to all your regular server-side rendered content. I turned JavaScript off here, and so I have this little messaging that says JavaScript has been disabled, or you can have something similar to that, or you can throw a fallback in there.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Did you make any API calls after you load the page to fetch further content?
I'm going to get to that in the next slide. Yeah.
What about data caching filters, things like that to help?
I'll get to that in about 3 slides. Anybody else? I'll be covering SEO too, so if you have questions about that. But yeah, those are all really good questions because they're very relevant for this talk. So after doing this for about, I think this is 4 or 5 projects I've taken this approach. I have some takeaways. And just as a disclaimer, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you how to build your APIs or structure your data or structure your apps. These are just my experiences and what I've come to learn. But so just some reflections about building APIs. I tend to serve up all the data at once, and that's if possible. So to answer your question, I don't make a ton of subsequent API calls. I say if possible because for a lot of people this is just not going to work. Depending on your content. Luckily, or just based on the projects I've had, it's been a finite set of content that's been pretty set. Not a lot of changes throughout the day, so I can serve that all at once. I reduce the asynchronous requests also if possible because you're just introducing a lot of network latency and the things that you want to avoid anyway, or you're trying to avoid to begin with this approach. Especially when you have when you're using a mobile device, and you have to make a ton of asynchronous requests after the initial bootstrap. It's going to really slow your site down. So that's why I tend to recommend serving it all at once, even if it's just a big ball of content. And I'll show you. I have a pretty good benchmark to show why that isn't a terrible idea. My third point is that Drupal schema doesn't always lend itself to API creation. That Rest Ful Web Services module does a really great job along with views to create your APIs. But sometimes it's a little hard to extend and get the markup how you want it, or to format a particular field. And so there are many ways to create APIs in Drupal, such as that web services module, but I prefer just to use a custom module with a menu hook. So that would just be querying the database, iterating through a bunch of nodes, and then for each node, just formatting that content exactly how I want, instead of having a layer of views and RESTful web services. It's a little more time consuming, but it gets me the flexibility I want, and it also removes a lot of the cruft that Drupal gives. Like Drupal will try to tell you all the information about when the content was updated, the author, all this content that you really don't care about at this level, and you just want to just get down to the basic necessities of the content. So I just hooked that up, custom module up to a menu hook for all my applications. API caching, to cover the other gentleman's question, is really important, especially when you want to scale this website or scale your applications. The good news is it doesn't have to be super complicated either. Drupal's built-in page caching already does a lot of work for you. It'll cache your API. And also, it's easy to extend and build redundant layers of caching with Drupal's built-in caching functions. Also, a fifth point that I should have here is that if you're working on Pantheon or Acquia, you already have Varnish installed likely. So that's even another layer of caching that'll make your API more performant. And I'll go over the benchmarks in a couple slides. But the general gist of the API caching implementation is that when you have an expensive query, like you're looping through your nodes, your content, you just set that cache. You just take that JSON and just save it in cache in the database. And that every time you update a piece of content, you insert a content, or you run a cron job, you can add hooks to that to clear and rebuild that cache. We found that in the calendar application, we weren't doing this, and the client was like, our changes aren't showing up for another 4 hours, and it really doesn't fly when these people, they want to see their content updated in real time on the front end. So that's why we have to clear and rebuild the cache every time we update a piece of content or insert a piece of content, just to satisfy those requests. This isn't perfect though. If you were to, on the Drupal GUI, just clear the cache, you're also going to clear this cache value. And you can certainly opt for more performance with changes to your stack, like if you want to throw a Node.js server in there. I mentioned Lullabot uses CouchDB server. That's a little bit beyond the scope of this talk, but if you want to opt for more performance, options are available to you. Just as a basic diagram, so when the user requests the API, you could have Drupal's page cache working for you. If that's not set, then you would just hit the Drupal variable cache. That's the caching method that I mentioned here. We're going to set the cache after an expensive query. So if you adjust the page, the content adjacent to this app, or and you clear the Drupal page cache is cleared, you still have this cache right here to be to fall back on. So ideally, the user will never have to rebuild that query from the database again. Also, keen observers might say the cache is in the database, and that's correct. This is a super oversimplification. This database really just represents that expensive query. And I'll show you the benchmarks why you don't want the user to actually have to rebuild this manually. You want everything to be stored in some level of cache. Also, if you have Varnish, if you're on Pantheon, or you have Acquia at your disposal, you have this third level of Varnish caching that you can hit to. But if you miss, you still have these levels. So having three, I typically have 3 redundant layers of caching. Might seem excessive, but the results are actually pretty compelling. For the calendar example, it was almost 11,000 nodes with about 17 fields each. So it ended up being about 50 kilobytes of data, which is about the size of a small, medium-sized image. So this is kind of why, this number right here is kind of why I tend to just throw all the data to the client, automatically or initially, and just have that stored in memory. Because, really the performance benefits of just, having this be 2 or 3, if you just wanted to show that month's data, introducing all that network latency is going to remove all the downsides of just serving this as a big ball of content once, having the client stored in memory, and then just having it there as a reference for them to interact with. But to look at the table right here, for this example, if the client was actually rebuilding that query manually, so there's no caching, it took on average about 3.5 seconds with a pretty big range. So sometimes it took 5 or 6 seconds, sometimes a little bit quicker, but there's a lot of variability there. And then if we introduce the page caching and the variable caching, that dropped significantly down to about 400 milliseconds. And also became a lot more consistent. And then if we added that one more layer of varnish caching, we got that down to less than 200 milliseconds, and it was even more consistent. So with each layer of caching that we introduce, we make the API quicker, more consistent, and also it'll just mean that the user has a more pleasant experience overall. So I've been mentioning server-side rendering a lot, and that's PHP server-side rendering. But there's a lot of work being done for doing JavaScript server-side rendering. It's a pretty big deal. React, Angular, Riot, a lot of frameworks are supporting server-side rendering for JavaScript. This talk doesn't do it justice. There are a lot of very intelligent minds working on this. But the idea is that ideally you don't want to have to bootstrap your app, have the app request the API, have the CMS respond. Steps 3 through 6, it's a performance hindrance that we introduce with this technique. But if you did some server-side rendering to render that JavaScript on the server side, you could eliminate these steps and just have the app be ready when the user gets this response back. Have it be ready, have all the content at its disposal. And so if you really want to eke out that much more performance, you might want to do some server-side rendering. So you can do this in 2 different ways, I've learned. You can use a simple solution and just use a view, or you can have a more robust solution like add a node server to your stack or something. I personally have never implemented the second option. When you're hosting PHP and you're running a node server, it's just a lot of cognitive overhead that I don't want to have to deal with. Also, just limited hosting resources. A lot of our clients don't want to have to pay for hosting for a node server end on top of paying for their Drupal hosting. And it's also based on your resources and times in your time allocated. So normally I just go with a view. I just do a lot of server-side rendering for these applications using a view, which is a nifty little trick. So with the example of the calendar application that I mentioned earlier, I made this view. You can't really see it, but this is just a view how you would make normally. I have an event content type, and I'm filtering based on the day. So you don't want to show events that happened in the past. You only want to show events that are in the future. And then I sort by date. But this is a super basic view that just gets our content bundled up together. And so the way this looks and the way I embed this is that I have this calendar div with an ID of calendar, and then I include this line right here, the views embed view. This is a Drupal 7 technique. I haven't done this with Drupal 8 yet, but the idea would still probably apply here. You would print out the view here, and so what happens is that before the app bootstraps, you have this content in the DOM, and once that app bootstraps, it's going to wipe away all of this content and then do its client-side rendering. This no-script, style tag, this is just a little implementation detail to prevent any sort of flickering. So I really don't want people to see this this content flicker on first render. It was a pretty nasty flicker. But this is just, if you think about it, this is a fallback. If you have no JS or if JS failed, you still have this views content here to fall back on for the user to view. So to show you what this looks like on that Brick website, you can kind of see it. Typekit isn't loading, so all our fonts are using the browser defaults. But if we go to that events and performances page, we still have all of our content here. It's still crawlable. It's still accessible. It's not pretty. Unfortunately, it doesn't function the same, but that's okay. It was okay for us to say we're going to limit the functionality of this fallback, just so long as people can see the content, click through it, the links work. That was a limitation that we were okay with. You don't have to replicate all the calendar functionality if the user doesn't have JavaScript or, for whatever reason, a packet dropped or something. I'm not going to touch on it too much, but if you wanted to implement a more robust solution than a view, if you want to have more performance, it would look kind of like this. You'd probably want to have a node server sandwiched between your app and your CMS, and then have the API feed to the node server, interpret that, something like this. Again, I haven't implemented this, so I don't know all the tricks and the details of this. So just to bring it all together again, I want to show the Princeton undergraduate admissions example again. Regular Drupal site here, but once you get to this Contact Us page, we bootstrap this miniature application, and then we select a topic for these questions, and we have all this client-side rendering occurring. So we're not waiting for the server to render and interpret our requests. All of it is happening right on the client side. And also we can have little cool tricks. Because we have so much flexibility with how we render it on the client side and the templating, and we're not wedded to views and templates and the different the wasteful markup that Drupal gives and the opinionated way that it does it, we can do cool things like work with the the history, and we can say let's look at the hash that you have in the URL. And make an intelligent decision, interpret that, and then show the user the exact question that they were linked to. But also, if we run through it again, well, you could see that I turned off JavaScript, and you could see all the content right there, so that Google can crawl it successfully. If someone does have JavaScript, they can crawl it successfully. Screen readers can interpret it. It's not pretty, but at least it's there, and your content isn't invisible to non-visual users. So just a general takeaway. The headless approach isn't about following the trend and applying it haphazardly. It's really about engineering a product or a site that's using the best at what you have. So if you really need a custom experience, super headless might be the way to go. If you have a basic architecture, a basic website, you probably don't want to implement a fully headless site. It's just going to be way too much headache. It's cool to tell people that you built your site headless, but it's going to be a maintenance nightmare. But if you have these little cool applets in your site that you want to be, extra special, a little extra responsive, you can apply the hybrid approach and get some really great results. But yeah, so with that said, I found that the hybrid approach has yielded some of the best results, both for users, content managers, developers, and so I'm really excited to see more people take this approach instead of just going either headless or traditional, all or nothing. So I really just want to see what cool things people make. And since it's not all or nothing, there's little investment, and you can start using on your site as soon as today. And if it doesn't work, you just roll it back and do the old method. You're not having to start from scratch and build this giant behemoth of a headless application. You can just start with maybe like a side menu or something, or some little some little component, much like this Contact Us page. The rest of the site was pretty basic, so we didn't need this super functional interface. So it just made sense to make this little applet right here. So it's just a little bit of an investment, but we got a lot out of it, and the client was very happy. So yeah, that's it. I have my presentation. I have the demo files on my GitHub. You can just search Will Ved. You can probably find this. So, does anyone have any questions? If you can't tell, I love talking about this. So I just, the more questions that you have, the better.
What kind of challenges have you faced scaling out as you build additional
headless sections to sites. What kind of challenges have you faced regarding, where to put code, how, whether you're sharing code bases for some of your front-end technologies? What kind of scalability things have you run into with that?
I usually just separate the application out into its own directory in the theme. If I understand your question correctly, you're asking that as I add more sections to the site that have these headless components, what challenges do I have?
Yeah.
Really none, because they're so isolated. With the example of this contact us section, it's just a directory I have in the theme, and I just call it contact us. And so if you had multiple sections, you just name those appropriately. I guess the one piece of scaling issue I had in particular was in the Brick website we had this media and education resources that was also a headless implementation, and this events and performances that was also, or those two were headless. The problem becomes how do you identify when to insert those? And so in the template, I just have I just use a template hook, and I say, all right, if the node ID equals 57, that 57 node correlates to this nodes and performances. The one point where that breaks down is if the content author deletes that page or they make a new one. So what I've had to do is I'd had to abstract out those connections. Also, when you're doing your API stuff and you're using things like menus, you want to keep track of those NIDs so that you know that one NID in one page has one application to it and the others have their application. So I abstract that out with a configuration page. So I can say, the contact us page that has an NID of 51, the events, this education page that has the NID of 42. So as you grow that, the possibility exists of people deleting the pages that these apps exist on, but it's not lost forever. You just have to keep track of where those pages are and intelligently assign the templates to those. And also that goes with the templating suggestions as well. You have to intelligently know when to insert those applications. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, pretty much. I was just thinking more if you had shared components between your different...
Oh, shared components. Yeah, so actually on the JavaScript side. So I have had that issue before. And really there are elegant ways of countering that. But in the interest of time, I just duplicated the component. I've only ever had to do that once, though. Usually these are one-offs where you don't share components between each other. So that's a problem that I haven't quite solved yet. Yeah, but you're right. You're right about that.
You store the for the song where you set up the Drupal. Are you storing the media offsite, like the AWS, or you're calling it from another location other than being inside your Drupal site?
No, it's all inside Drupal, all inside the Drupal database. Okay. And that's the power of it, because if someone knows how to manage Drupal content and they can log in, they can adjust all the content that goes along with. Where's the example? They can manage all the content. They can. All it is just this content type with these fields. I have an ID, I have an artist field, I have a title field. These are all fields that exist in the Drupal side.
So you basically made content types column, like you said.
Yeah.
And then associated the media player, the media file with that social.
Yeah. So the actual media player is an iframe that I stole from but I embedded from SoundCloud. So that was an embed code, but pretty much the architecture of it, the surrounding. Everything except this media player right here. So this content, the title, this toggle, these inputs. That's all the application. But all this content right here is being administered via Drupal. But the embed code itself is stored in Drupal. Yeah, that's offsite. Yeah.
So if you had a view that produced 10,000 nodes, and then you 46K download, I assume that you're not actually pulling in images at the same time. It's only if the user's hovering over a particular item in the calendar or whatever that you actually load the image.
Correct. Yeah. So that's just the raw references to those images. So you're going to have to make additional HTTP requests to fetch those images, but you're doing that anyway. Really, the reason I suggest people store all this, or send all the content in one bundle, is because it's relatively cheap to send a bunch of information using this method. It's just the raw content. If you had to render this all and add markup in there, you would bloat the size. If I had to speculate, maybe like 10 times with the markup. This is just the bare minimum information you need to render that application. And I'd like to eliminate like redundancies too, and eliminate fields that I don't need. So you'll see I don't include any of the published by, I don't include any of the author information. It's just the bare minimum, so I can keep that. When it balloons to 10,000, 100,000 nodes, I'm keeping that file size that it sends relatively small. That's a good question.
Any thoughts on Memcache on this mix?
Yeah, so we do have Memcache running in all these setups, but that happens on a level that doesn't really pertain to this approach. So Memcache, as I understand it, it really just happens all in here. If you imagine the database here, the interaction between the database and the CMS, that's really where Memcache is going to shine. Whereas like this approach really is focused on, the caching of this approach really happens like on, right here. We want to make sure, on this level that the content, we don't have to make expensive database queries. But if you do, Memcache would help you there. So if I bring up that table again, yeah. So this table with the no cache, if you had Memcache, it would just apply to this figure. So if you didn't have Memcache, it might be a lot higher. That's something I didn't consider when I benchmarked this application. But frankly, I really didn't care. Like the benchmark was this figure, and I wanted to improve on it. But if you had Memcache, you would just be improving this. It really wouldn't apply too much to the Drupal variable cache, and definitely not to varnish caching.
We're going to be having a Birds of a Feather headless Drupal talk at 2:45. So we hope to take a deep dive into stuff like sharing components and what happens when we have just a ton of nodes and stuff like that. Are you inviting me, or? Okay.
Are you? Yeah. No. That sounds really cool. Like I said, this approach is kind of scary at first. Talking about APIs and stuff like that, but really, if you use this, if you use the hybrid headless approach, and you're not just diving. Where's my very intricate figure? Sorry. If you just keep it pretty isolated on one side and just start small, and then keep your Drupal site, as normal with a traditional PHP server-side rendering, you can keep it pretty isolated and start to do some pretty cool work. Especially with Drupal 8, now that they have the web services module, it's really easy to start and build your own API. Like this step, you're just making a view. Once you make that view, you have access to this. And then once you have access to this, you can, all JavaScript frameworks have built-in functions to parse this and make it really easy for you to render this content. So it's advanced, but it's also accessible to beginners as well if you just want to get your toes wet. All right, cool. If anyone, hold on. If anyone wants to talk about this, I'm open for questions. Pretty much about anything. This is the one thing in my life I get really amped up about. So please feel free to talk to me about this approach. If you have any questions, you're welcome to. So that's it.
And that headless Birds of a going to be in room 108 at 2:45.
What time?
2:45, I think.
Great, thanks. Oh yeah, it's all in here. Yeah, so I have like the database and stuff. Yeah.